Hello, this is Mark Tooley, president of the Institute on Religion and Democracy here in Washington, D.C., with the pleasure today of talking to my New York friend, Andrés Spokoiny. I hope I'm pronouncing your last name correctly, Andrés, who is from Argentina, but now president of the Jewish Funders Network, as mentioned, in New York City, and has a new book out called Tradition and Transition, Jewish Communities and the Hyper-Empowered Individual, about and for Jews, but with principles and insights for all people, Christians, Jewish, and otherwise. So thank you, Andrés, for joining this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark, for being here, and hi to all the listeners out there. I'm a big admirer of your work.
Well, thank you. Likewise. Now, in the Christian world, Christians love to complain about all of the social problems resulting from the quote-unquote autonomous individual. We don't often hear similar Jewish insights. So fill us in. What is this book about? Why did you write it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, Jews love to complain also, as you know, but we more than a complaint of the autonomous individual is an analysis of, say, instead of complaining, let's see how we got here, and let's see what do we do now with the autonomous individual. And I call it the hyper-empowered individual, because what I do in the book is I trace the history of how the individual became what it is now in the 21st century. It's a long story. We're talking about, probably 500 years of a road that takes us probably from the Reformation, which contributes a lot to the creation of this Western idea of an independent self, to the hyper-empowered person of today. And I call it hyper-empowered because all the features of modernity in the 21st century are on steroids now. We're not, as I said, people today are not just autonomous. They have a degree of autonomy that keeps expanding in concentric circles. The first autonomy probably was from, the diktats of the king and the Catholic Church. So we gained that, autonomy. And but now we keep emancipating the individual from more and more things. And lately we emancipated him or her from biology, basically, right? The whole culture of trans, I mean, excluding the cases where you have real gender dysphoria and what have you, can be seen as an attempt, in a way, to emancipate the human from their own biology, right? So in this context, right, what happens to religion and what happens to communities? Now, Jews generally tend to make lemonade with the lemons of history, right? Like sort of every confrontation with a new philosophical or technological change prompted a Jewish response. And the Jewish world that we see today, that you probably know, that your listeners probably know, with different denominations, Orthodox, Reform, Conservative, Zionist, etc., is in fact a response to the zeitgeist of the 19th century. In other words, the first modernity, what Zygmunt Bauman called the solid modernity, the modernity of the 19th century, creates a clash between sort of traditional Judaism and the new spirit of the time, human independency, technological revolution, scientific, etc. And the response to that is like a ray of light coming through a prism, right? And different responses get. In that, Judaism is also similar to Protestantism in a way, right? Like the Catholic Church has a different mechanism, right? The Pope or the Vatican decides. Jews created different responses the same way different Christian denominations created different responses to modernity. Okay, but all that was in the 19th century. Now we're in the 21st century, and the set of realities that created the Jewish world of today is no longer there, right? We're in a different world with a different individual, with an individual that went, as I said, from being autonomous to be hyper empowered, with new technological tools, with a freedom of choice that radicalized. You know, it's not that you're free to choose, is that you've never had so much freedom of choice. And that creates, of course, a high degree of liberty, but also a deep malaise, right? And a deep sense of alienation. So this is the universe in which we live. And the last point, and I think is the most important, is that the individual of today not only has to choose between different identities, but for the first time in history, has to build his own identity. In other words, it's not just that I choose between, and that's what differentiates actually the 19th century from the 21st century. Jews in the 19th century, and I think the same goes for Christians, would have needed to choose between, okay, what do I want to be? I want to be a Reformed Jew, I want to be a conservative Jew, I want to be an Orthodox or an ultra-Orthodox Jew, which, by the way, ultra-Orthodoxy is also a response to modernity. It's not safe from modernity. So what do I want to be? And you choose a package. Today, that doesn't work anymore. Today, most Jews will define themselves as post-denominational. In other words, they build their own cocktail. They'll build their own identity. And this is what society demands of you now. It doesn't demand of you to fulfill a given role. It doesn't even demand you to choose between different alternatives of identity. You have no alternative but to build your own identity. Okay, so that, by definition, is going to impact both religion and also communal life. It will impact belonging, it will impact synagogue membership, it will impact philanthropy in the Jewish community, it will impact everything. It will be a seismic change of enormous proportion. So that's the descriptive part of the book. Did I lose you?
No, not at all. So I've never heard it put that way, but from inheriting identity to choosing identity to now having to build identity.
Correct.
More and more pressure, such freedom. There's a positive side to that, but such a burden, so overwhelming.
It's completely overwhelming. Actually, there's an amazing book called The Wariness of Self by a French psychiatrist called Alain Ehrenberg. And in French, it sounds better. It's called La fatigue d'être soi. You know, the fatigue of being yourself, right? Because the world, the pre-modern world, was a world without freedom, but it was also a world without regret, or with much less regret, right? Your father was a carpenter, you'll be a carpenter. You know, you couldn't regret your romantic choices because you hadn't any. Marriages were arranged. So, but now you have to choose, and you have to choose every step of the way. So that creates a lot of regret, a lot of second guessing, a lot of anxiety, a lot of depression. So the traditional world had no freedom, or had no freedom of choice. The medieval world, let's say, the modern world doesn't have freedom from choice, right? But now, the premise of the book is that you can't turn the clock back. Besides, I don't know if it's desirable to turn the clock back, right? I don't think anybody wants a world in which, women and, of course, Jews and are second-class citizens, or a world in which you have no choice. But then how do you have meaning? How do you deal with this freedom of choice? How do you build community in a world in which the individuals choose their own path, are forced to choose their own path? Peter Berger has a beautiful book from the 80s, actually, it's very prophetic. It's called the Heretic Imperative. It basically says, a heretic in Greek, erateikon, is somebody who chooses, somebody who makes a choice, right? So he says, in the 20th century was his case, he says, we're all forced to be heretics. We're forced to choose, to the point that even rejecting to choose is a choice. And as a choice, I could say, for example, my book follows sort of a fictional Jewish woman that is dealing with all of this, right? And Rachel. And at some point, I said, well, Rachel could choose to live in a Hasidic community where she really constricts her freedom of choice radically. But the paradox is that would be a choice too. And as a choice, it would be subjected to the same level of regret and anxiety and second guessing than any other choice, right? But the point is, okay, we could say, whatever we're gonna do, we see where the chips fall in terms of how Jews recreate Judaism and they recreate communal life in the 21st century, or we could be proactive and invest some thinking in creating new models of community that don't seek to either fully embrace or fully reject this hyper-empowered individual. In other words, how do we create a dialogue between this zeitgeist and the type of values that made the Jewish community historically? And as I said, for the Jews, it was always that was our pattern, right? Like you confront Islam in the 7th century and a new thinking comes up. You confront, scholastic Aristotelianism in the 10th century, and you get Maimonides creating a whole new. You confront the Gnosis and the early mystics, and you have Kabbalah as a response to that. So what is the response then that we have today? And you tell me, it seems to me that is not very different to what's happening to many Christian communities in a way.
Very similar. Now, Andrés, is it fair to say that Jews basically invented the concept of the individual? It's there in the opening words of Genesis. So there we have it.
Correct.
We're individuals. We all have these amazing choices before us that God has allowed us. But how do we stay within the proper parameters? What is the Jewish answer?
Right. So yes and no. Like Judaism and the Judeo-Christian tradition has this concept of the individual, right? And the individual has intrinsic dignity of divine dignity, and therefore life is precious and human life is precious, and the human body is a vessel of holiness, and it can be mistreated or subjected to pain or torture. It all comes from that. But it's a different type of individual, the one in the Judeo-Christian tradition. And there is debate about the term Judeo-Christian, but I think in this particular case, the term is very well used because Christianity really inherits this concept of individual dignity. And as I said before, Protestantism enhances that notion of an individual by retaking something originally Jewish, which is the disintermediation of the relationship with God, right? Like, you correct me if I'm wrong, but sort of Protestantism goes back to this idea that you don't need an intermediate in the form of the church or a vicar, as it were, to connect with God. So in that sense, there is, of course, a concept of an individual, but the notion that that individual is the source and locus of truth and goodness, that's what's new in modernity.
Hmm.
Starting to look, right? And that's not what Judaism or Christianity tell you. It is upwards, look to God. He's going to tell you what's your mission in life. You don't discover it yourself. It's not self-generated. I mean, you may discover it, but it's something that God planted in you.
Hmm.
All that stuff is not how it is now. And the question is, again, can we arrive at a synthesis? Can we say, can we mix this subjective, introspective nature of the modern self with a higher calling? And I think that we'll see. I mean, that's what will determine, I think, the relevance of religion in the 21st century. I don't think that rejecting individuality, not individualism, individuality, it's two different concepts. Rejecting individuality, I don't think it's going to work. It's like people tried it already. People hate this freedom of choice, but they're not willing to part with it. And I don't think it's good. But so rejecting it's not going to work. The question is how we can create collectively, and that's going to be a challenge for Judaism. It's going to be a challenge for Christianity. Now you have folks like Patrick Deneen that talk about the Benedictine option. That there is this idea of let's sort of put people on a cage, on a voluntary cage sort of thing. And some in the Jewish community are saying the same. Let's go back to a normativism, to a more stronger normativism that liberal Judaism kind of lost. I don't know. Maybe it will work for some, maybe not for others. I think that there are going to be a series of responses, and time will tell which will be more relevant. But what the thing that worries me more really, I mean, the theological aspects, the philosophical aspects worry me, but the aspect that worries me that is much more immediate, I would say, is the community aspect. For example, one of the arguments of the book is that this hyper-empowered individual creates three concentric crises, or three interlocking crises, rather. A crisis of meaning, this is what we are discussing here, about how to find meaning when in a world of autonomous, disconnected individual. Two, a crisis of community. Why there's a crisis of community or a crisis of belonging? Why? Because the hyper-autonomous individual sees belonging to any collective framework as a restriction of her freedom, right? And borders are bad because borders restrict your freedom. Think about it this way. Everything good today is without borders. Doctors without borders and lawyers without borders. There's this idea that belonging to something particular is not great. So there's a crisis of belonging, a crisis of community. And third, there's a crisis of organizational structures. And again, I hear some of the things you say about declining affiliation in some Christian denomination. It rings a bell for me too. But I think that the problem is that the organizational structures of the Jewish community were all created for a different type of individuals. For a classic example, a Jewish community center will provide programs and courses and workshops and activities for their members, correct? Now, you would say that's great. There's a great offer of courses and of things that somebody can go in the local JCC. Only that what's the problem with that? The model of today is that individuals want to create their own product, their own thing. They want to deploy their own creativity. Is what Charles Taylor called the expressive individual. The individual wants to express itself. On the one hand, we're very consumeristic. On the other hand, what we consume is what we all create. Think about YouTube. YouTube became, now it's different, but it became popular not because people were downloading, people were uploading. Now, communal organizations and religious organizations are based on the idea that you're going to download stuff. You're going to go, you're going to listen to a sermon. You're going to participate in a youth group, whatever, and somebody's going to do the program for you. But that's not where individuals are at now. They want to co-create, right? So there's this crisis of structures in the Jewish community. And last but not least, I mean, again, I don't know how that works in the Christian world, but in America at least, most synagogues are membership-based. Now, being a member today is countercultural because of what we were saying before. There are 5 synagogues in my neighborhood. Being a member of one limits me, limits my freedom. So I don't want to limit my freedom. I want to go, maybe I want to go this one or to that one. Maybe the synagogue, next door is a conservative synagogue, but I don't like the service so much. Or maybe, I don't like what they say about Israel, whatever. I want to create, as it were, my own denomination based on that. So why would I pay membership to one rather to use the others? And then that generates a crisis on the business model, really, of many synagogues. Incidentally, and again, it would be fascinating for me to learn a little bit more about how this thing affected Christian communities, but COVID was an accelerator of much of that. Because if I am already logging into a Shabbat service on Zoom, for those that are not Orthodox, right? So why do I need to log into the mediocre synagogue around the block? I log into whatever, Rabbi Wolpe or Rabbi Browse, but then I'm not paying membership on Rabbi Wolpe synagogue. I'm just leeching into the Zoom, right? So how that puts even more stress. So COVID served as an accelerator of many of these phenomena. It gave people more choice, right? And it even made some of the problems of community even more acute. It's true, we all pray for human contact after COVID, but that's a first reaction. The structural problems became more problematic.
Now, we're always hearing how the only growing segment of American Judaism are the very conservative Orthodox, but I assume this trend is also affecting them. How are they hyper-empowered individuals among the ultra-conservative Orthodox?
It's a fascinating question. So first of all, it's kind of half a fallacy. It is true that the Orthodox segment is growing, but the Orthodox segment is growing only through demographic change. In other words, they simply have more children. And even the Orthodox, like if you look at the Pew Report, for example, 50% of the people who grew up Orthodox are not Orthodox today. Some are conservative, reform, secular, and some are more ultra-Orthodox. So there's fluidity there too. Now, again, there's no escape from choice. You can say, I'm hyper-conservative because I don't want to choose. I believe in the authority of the rabbi, and that's all I'm going to follow. Well, it doesn't work like that. Too late. Too late. Besides, by the way, let's start by saying that Orthodoxy and ultra-Orthodoxy is also a modern creation. The Hasidic garb you see is not from the times of Abraham. It's from the 19th century. Chabad, one of the most important, ultra-Orthodox groups, was created in 1814, 40 years later than Reformed Judaism. Sort of, in other words, it's akin or is similar to kind of the fundamentalist Christian revival in a way. it's sort of a reaction to modernity, saying modernity is perceived as very threatening, so we'll close off Judaism from modernity. So let's start by saying that. So if you were created by modernity, you're not going to be immune from what modernity is doing. So, as I said, on the one hand, there is change and there is fluidity. On the second hand, there is a huge crisis of authority that is underreported in the Orthodox world, and especially in the ultra-Orthodox world. We saw a little bit during COVID, when the rabbis were saying one thing and people were saying another thing. We see it very interestingly in terms of voting in Israel. You know that in Israel historically, the ultra-Orthodox voted as a bloc. Whatever the rabbis told them to vote, they would vote. That's fracturing too. In the last election, a lot of ultra-Orthodox voted for other parties, and now there's very interesting to see that, you know, in Israel, I don't know if you're following the news, but the government said that they're going to recruit actually the High Court said that they're going to recruit the Haredim, that's the proper term, to serve in the army, right? And the rabbis are very opposed, but the people are not. The young people want to serve, they want to. So it is, you know, from afar, the Orthodox world or the ultra-conservative Jewish world may look like an homogeneic, sort of very solid, very immune to change sector, but when you get close to the surface, there's a lot of changes there. A lot of changes, for example, in the status of women, you know, because what happens is that in many cases, women go to work and men stay study. So the women are vectors of change. They see the world. They see the world. Like usage of internet, for example, among Haredi people is enormous, despite the efforts of the rabbis to quell it. I mean, it's still, you know, there's a very vibrant internet, you know, web communication among young Haredim. So nobody's exempt. My personal opinion, and happy to debate this with people that know more, is that, as I said, you can't avoid the reckoning and the confrontation with this hyper-empowered individual. As much as you want to, you can't avoid it. The same way you can't avoid the scientific revolution. I mean, you couldn't avoid it. Even, well, the Amish to some extent do, but they're a small minority. If you want to be a mainstream, if you want to be integrated in the world, you need to manage that thing of flowing with the stream and against the stream at the same time.
So, Andres, it's very fashionable now to diss on liberalism and to put forward post-liberal proposals and to wax nostalgic about some kind of restored, more coercive society. But those proposals aren't going anywhere, are they?
No, they're not going anywhere, and the restorative aspect of it is not really restorative. They basically imagine a mythical past that never existed, you know, and they say we should go back to that. You know, it's like it's an idealized version that never happened. I mean, I laugh when people say, "Oh, we should go back to what we were in the 50s." Really? Like, first of all, if you're a woman or non-white, you didn't have such a great time in the 50s. Kids were doing, the life expectancy was in the 60s. Children were doing nuclear drills at school. I mean, there's no, what part of the 50s do you really like? You know, like the fact that, you know, and I mean, And I think that it's dangerous. I think that every totalitarian project sought one of two things: either a restoration to a mythical past that never existed, or a utopian future that could never exist. You know, fascism was a restoration of a national glory that had never existed in the first place. And communism was a utopian thing that could never exist. And we know how they both ended. So I think we need to be, that's why I come from the perspective that rejecting liberalism is not going to work and is not desirable. What I do think is that, like, in Hegelian terms, we need to yearn for a synthesis, for a system that gets most of liberalism and the aspects, and try to recover some of the aspects that we lost, that there are definitely not the authority of a strong man as president or dictator, is more about the sense of community, the sense of belonging, you know, the sense of human, sort of this idea that there's intrinsic value in being part of a community, right?
So
yeah.
you're echoing Patrick Deneen's Benedict option, which you cited, but your proposals are a little more elastic, aren't they?
Yeah, I don't think, I mean, if I think that Patrick Deneen, I think he favors a rejection of liberalism. I don't. And I don't think it's going to work. I mean, I don't think, first of all, I don't want it, because I think that liberalism gave us and still give us, I mean, we have no idea. I mean, as you know, I lived in countries that were not illiberal. You have no idea how bad life is when you don't have liberalism. You really have no idea. And you think
Argentina, you live in Argentina under the colonels, of course.
I live in Argentina under the generals. And then I worked in Eastern Europe as communism was falling, which it was a different type of totalitarianism. It's like people think, you know, well, it's not going to target you. It always targets you, even if you don't. So I think that people shouldn't take liberalism for granted. I'm talking about classic liberalism. I'm not talking about liberalism of left. I'm talking about classic Enlightenment liberalism. Was the best thing that happened to humanity since the dawn of the human species. So in that I disagree with Patrick Deneen. I see his malaise. I share his malaise. The notion that a world of atomized individuals provides for a very sad and meaningless life. That I agree with him. But I think that the genius has to be, I mean, in a way, it's too simplistic. Oh, let's reject liberalism. It's too simplistic, too easy to work. What you need to do is you need to say, okay, how do I preserve what I want to preserve? And how do I recover part of what I want to recover, which is a meaningful life with others, a life of purpose, a life of that kind of stuff. And I think that we're very creative. I mean, I'm talking Jews and Christians, and especially the Protestant Christianity has that flexibility that allows them to try different ways. I do agree, though, with Patrick Deneen that communitarianism, in a way, is a good thing. I mean, the idea in Judaism, communities are more than social contracts. You know, this notion that the society is a social contract is the modern idea, which is very useful and is very good, but it's not enough. I mean, in Judaism, the society is it has sanctity in and of itself. Israel as a people is not just a contract among individuals, is a theological concept, right?
Mhm.
It
A
has
living organ. It's a
sorry,
living-
sorry,
it's a living organism. It's not just a
right,
concept.
right. Absolutely, it's a living organism. It has intrinsic value, not only as a as a as a as a as a group of people in and of itself. It has value. So that I totally, that I think it's an important thing. Like when you are part, like I think that works for religious groups, of course. I mean, I want that whenever it's part of the Jewish people feels that it's part of something important, whoever is part of America feels that America as a concept has a value that goes beyond providing prosperity and freedom for its inhabitants, right? I mean, it is that. It has to provide prosperity and freedom, but it also it needs to have some sort of transcendental dimension to being. It's a covenantal community. That's the term I was looking for.
Andres, we could go on for many hours. This has been a wonderful conversation. I commend to our listeners your book, Tradition and Transition, Jewish Communities and the Hyper-Empowered Individual. Just came online a few weeks ago, right?
Yeah, oh, this week, actually.
This week, fresh off the press. Andres, thank you so much. I enjoyed it. Let's talk again soon.
Thank you very much, Mark. All right.